In London, in 1853, séances had become common enough that even middle-class families were hosting them in their own homes. A typical scene from the period involved a small table, a room cleared of furniture, the gaslight lamps dimmed, and a handful of participants seated quietly, waiting for the medium to begin. Contemporary accounts describe the environment as controlled and deliberate. Hands joined, eyes closed, and every sound in the room noted carefully. Witnesses often reported a series of faint raps, sometimes from the underside of the table, sometimes from the walls or floorboards. These sounds were interpreted as attempts at communication. During one well-documented sitting, observers said the medium's breathing changed before she began speaking in what they believed was a trance state. She claimed to be communicating the story of a woman who had died by drowning. The participants took the information seriously, not as performance, but as potential evidence of contact with a surviving consciousness. Reports from the era also described tables rising at one end or shifting slightly on the floor. Movements the sitters interpreted as physical manifestations produced by unseen forces. To the people present, these weren't theatrical gestures. They were treated as data, observable, repeatable phenomena that suggested the possibility of life after death. For many Victorians, these early séances marked the first time the supernatural appeared to intersect with the measurable world, creating a moment where belief and investigation coexisted at the same table. Welcome to Arcane Station. I'm your host, Mike Porter. During the middle of the 19th century, Western society became obsessed with the idea that the living could talk to the dead. It began quietly in upstate New York in 1848, when two sisters claimed that strange knocking sounds in their farmhouse were the work of a ghost. Within a few years, séances were being held in major cities across America and Europe. Newspapers printed the transcripts. Prominent scientists attended the sessions, hoping to measure or explain what was happening. The movement was becoming known as spiritualism, a belief system that tried to merge faith with experiment. Its followers weren't content with sermons. They wanted data, demonstration, and direct experience. It was an age when invisible forces were being discovered almost weekly. Electricity, magnetism, the telegraph, all proved that unseen energy could move through space and carry information. For many, it wasn't a huge leap to imagine that human consciousness might do the same. Mediums became celebrities. Parlors turned into laboratories, and for a few decades, the line between science and the supernatural was not as clear as we imagine it to be today. Tonight, we'll look at how the world took shape, who started it, and why it caught fire, and how it forever changed the way we think about death and the unseen. To understand how the spiritualist movement exploded in the 19th century, we have to start a few decades earlier, in an age when science, religion, and philosophy were colliding in ways the world had never seen. By the late 1700s, Enlightenment thinking had reshaped Europe. Rationalism was the new religion. The telescope and microscope had revealed entire universes above and below human perception. Yet the old questions about the soul, about what happens after our death, didn't disappear. They just found new ways to express themselves. One of the earliest figures to influence the movement was Franz Anton Mesmer, an Austrian physician who believed that invisible forces connected all living things. He called it animal magnetism, a kind of universal energy that could be manipulated to heal illnesses. Mesmer's demonstrations in Paris during the 1780s drew enormous crowds. Patients would sit around large tubs of magnetized water while he passed iron rods over them, claiming to balance their internal energies. Some people fainted. Some claimed miraculous recoveries. Others entered trances and spoke in voices that weren't their own. To modern science, Mesmer's work was dismissed as suggestion or hypnosis, but his central idea that unseen forces could affect the mind and body lingered. That same idea would later underpin the belief that spirits could move objects or communicate through magnetic mediums. At roughly the same time, a Swedish scientist and theologian named Emanuel Swedenborg claimed to have developed the ability to visit the spiritual world while fully conscious. Swedenborg was no charlatan. He'd been a respected engineer and astronomer before these experiences began. He described meeting angels, speaking with spirits, and even traveling to different levels of heaven and hell. To him, the spiritual and physical world were made of the same divine substance, separated only by vibration or perception, a concept that would reappear in occult and metaphysical circles for centuries. Together, Mesmer and Swedenborg laid the groundwork, one through unseen energy, the other through direct spiritual travel. In 1848, the Fox sisters is a story about a half-century later that the groundwork found this spark in a small farmhouse in Hydesville, New York. In March of 1848, Margaret and Kate Fox, ages 15 and 11, told their parents that they were hearing strange knocking sounds in their bedroom walls. When they asked questions aloud, the knocks answered back, once for yes, twice for no. Before long, neighbors gathered to witness. The spirit, they said, claimed to be that of a traveling peddler who had been murdered in the house years before. News spread quickly. Newspapers reported on the Rochester rappings, and within months the Fox sisters were performing demonstrations in public halls, communicating with spirits before packed audiences. For many, it was the first time the supernatural had stepped out of folklore and into something that looked like an experiment. The appeal was enormous. At a time when American religion was splintering with revivals, new sects, and social upheaval, spiritualism offered something revolutionary: proof. You didn't need a priest or a preacher. You didn't even need a church. You could sit in your living room, ask questions, and get answers from beyond the grave. By the early 1850s, mediums were appearing in nearly every major city in the United States and Britain. They conducted table turnings, automatic writings, and trance communications. Families gathered nightly to listen for knocks or watch for the movement of a glass across a tabletop. Some of these mediums were sincere. Others learned to exploit the fascination for profit, but the hunger for contact was real, driven in part by a massive social changes of the Industrial Revolution, and later by the grief left in the wake of wars and epidemics. For women especially, spiritualism offered something almost unheard of at that time: a public voice. Many prominent mediums were young women, respected and even paid for their work, which was rare in the Victorian world. They claimed to channel not only the dead, but moral messages from a higher plane about peace, equality, and reform. In that sense, spiritualism became both a religious and a social movement. By the middle of the 19th century, the parlor séance had become a fixture of a respectable society, and what began as simple knocking sounds in a farmhouse soon evolved into a global obsession, one that scientists, writers, and philosophers couldn't ignore. By the middle of the 19th century, spiritualism had evolved from a local curiosity into international movement. By the middle of the 19th century, spiritualism had evolved from a local curiosity into an international movement. Parlors in London, Paris, and New York were being transformed into small laboratories of the unseen. The séance became the social ritual of its time, a blend of theater, religion, and scientific experimentation. A typical séance followed a familiar pattern: curtains drawn, lights dimmed, and a small group seated around a table, usually no more than 8 to 10 people. The medium, which was often a woman, would take her place at the center or head of the table. Hands were joined, forming what was called the magnetic chain. The atmosphere was quiet, reverent, and charged with expectation. Participants might begin with a prayer or a hymn. Then the medium would enter a trance, sometimes shallow, sometimes deep. Witnesses described visible, physical changes: a drop in temperature, flickering lights, rapping sounds, or the movement of small objects. If communication was established, it might come in various forms. As I said, raps or knocks, responding to questions, table tilting, which was raising, one or two legs into the air and tapping out messages from underneath the table. There was automatic writing, where the medium's hand scrawled words without conscious control, typically with their head pulled back and their eyes closed. Or trance speaking, where the medium's voice, accent, or personality would shift, claiming to channel the dead. The language was usually simple and direct. The spirits might identify themselves, a lost child, a soldier, a parent, and offer brief statements of comfort or advice. It was part religion, part performance, and completely compelling to a generation searching for proof that consciousness didn't end at death. Among the most famous mediums of the 19th century was a man named Daniel Douglas Home, Scottish-born, and he performed across Europe for nearly 3 decades. Home was unusual in that he refused payment for his seances, which earned him credibility even among skeptics. Witnesses, many of them prominent scientists and members of the aristocracy, reported seeing him levitate above the ground, elongate his body, and handle hot coals with his bare hands. In one of the most famous incidents, Home allegedly floated out of one third-floor window of a townhouse and re-entering through another window, in full view of several witnesses, including Lord Adair and Captain Wynne. Holmes' abilities were never definitively disproven. Some observers claimed fraud, others psychological suggestion, but even the era's most skilled debunkers admitted that his seances were baffling. A decade later, another name captivated the British public, Florence Cook, a young woman from London who began holding seances in her teenage years. Cook claimed to materialize a spirit named Katie King, the daughter of a deceased buccaneer. During seances, Katie would appear as a fully formed figure, dressed in white, speaking and moving independently of Florence, who was often found in a trance at the same time. Photographs of Katie King were taken by Sir William Crookes, one of Britain's leading scientists and a fellow of the Royal Society. Crookes publicly defended Cook's authenticity, saying he had witnessed Katie and Florence in the same room, side by side. Critics argued that the apparition was simply Florence in disguise, but Crookes' endorsement lent the case enormous influence. It was a striking moment when science and spiritualism briefly shared the same table. In Italy, the medium Giuseppe Palladino drew attention from researchers across Europe. Unlike Home or Cook, Palladino's seances were often chaotic, marked by table levitations, moving curtains, and touches from unseen hands. She was repeatedly tested under controlled conditions by scientists in Italy, France, and Britain. Even when bound to a chair or held by investigators, objects would shift or float. Yet she was also caught cheating on multiple occasions, freeing a hand or foot to produce the effect herself. For many researchers, Palladino became a case study in the complexity of belief. Were all her effects fraudulent, or did genuine phenomena occur alongside the trickery? The question remains open, illustrating how slippery the search for proof can be when psychology and desire are involved. By the late 1800s, new inventions entered the séance room. Spirit photography promised to capture the dead on film. Planchettes and later Ouija boards offered easier tools for communication, and some investigators inspired by telegraph began to imagine a mechanical device that might record voices from the beyond. Thomas Edison himself claimed to be experimenting with what he called a spirit communication device. Though no working model was ever found, his public comments blurred the line between scientific curiosity and the supernatural. In all of this, spiritualism mirrored its age, the search for the unseen, the desire to measure and map the invisible. The séance table became, for a time, as respectable as a laboratory bench. By the late 19th century, spiritualism had already reshaped how millions of people thought about life after death. But for some, séances and spirit raps were just the beginning. They believed the unseen world wasn't merely inhabited by ghosts of the departed, it was part of a vast structured system of hidden laws and energies that could be studied, mapped, and mastered. It was the birth of what historians call the Occult Revival, a period of stretching roughly from the 1850s to the early 1900s, when ancient mysticism, ceremonial magic, and esoteric philosophy were reinterpreted for the modern age. Where spiritualism sought communication, the occult sought understanding. While mediums continued to dominate the public imagination, a more intellectual undercurrent was forming. Thinkers across Europe began to collect, translate, and reinterpret texts of old mystical traditions: Hermeticism, Kabbalah, alchemy, and Gnosticism. Many of these ideas had circulated quietly for centuries, but the 19th century gave them new life, thanks to widespread printing, growing literacy, and a hunger for spiritual alternatives in an increasingly mechanized world. To people disillusioned by both organized religion and pure materialism, the occult offered a third path, one that promised spiritual experience and intellectual rigor. The revival's intellectual foundation was laid by Eliphas Lévi, born Alphonse Louis Constant, a French writer and a former Catholic seminarian. In the 1850s, Lévi published Dogma et rituel de la haute magie, the doctrine and ritual of high magic. His writing reframed magic not as a superstition or witchcraft, but as a symbolic language of the soul. Lévi's imagery, especially as depiction of the Baphomet, a horned figure representing the balance of opposites, became iconic. He described magic as the science of the will, the art of causing change in the accordance with one's inner intent. For Lévi, the magician was not a conjurer, but a philosopher, a person who sought unity between the divine and the material world. His work influenced nearly every occultist who came after him, and his reinterpretation of the symbols bridged medieval mysticism and modern psychology. If Lévi built the foundation, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky built the temple. A Russian-born traveler and writer, Blavatsky founded the Theosophical Society in 1875 with Henry Still Olcott and William Q. Judge. The Society's mission was broad: to study comparative religion, explore the hidden powers of nature, and promote the idea of universal brotherhood of humanity. Blavatsky claimed to have studied with hidden masters in Tibet and to channel their teachings. Her books, Isis Unveiled in 1877 and The Secret Doctrine in 1888, blended elements of Eastern philosophy, Western mysticism, and emerging scientific concepts. She described the universe as evolving through cycles, both physical and spiritual, and suggested that humanity itself was progressing towards higher planes of consciousness. Theosophy captured the imagination of thousands. It introduced Western audiences to Hindu and Buddhist ideas decades before they became mainstream, and it provided an intellectual framework for what would later become the New Age movement. By the 1880s, the Occult Revival reached its organizational peak in Britain with the founding of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Created by William Wynne Westcott and Samuel Liddell MacGregor Mathers and William Robert Woodman, all Freemasons, the Golden Dawn was structured like a mystical academy. Members advanced through degrees, studying subjects ranging from astrology and alchemy to the invocation of angels and the symbols of the tarot. The order's rituals combined Judeo-Christian mysticism with Egyptian symbolism and the Kabbalistic tree of life. Initiates were taught that true magic was the alignment of will, imagination, and divine purpose. The Golden Dawn attracted many of the era's most influential writers and thinkers, including W.B. Yeats, the poet, Florence Farr, the actress, and eventually Aleister Crowley, who would later become infamous for his radical reinterpretations of magic and philosophy. Though internal disputes eventually fractured the group, its influence was immense. The structure and symbolism of the Golden Dawn would go on to shape much of 20th century's occultism, from ceremonial magic to modern Wicca. Despite its secrecy, the Occult Revival left a visible mark on culture. Bookstores sold volumes on astral projection and psychic development. Artists and architects began using occult geometry and symbolism. Even in scientific circles, there was a cautious fascination with the idea that consciousness might extend beyond the physical body. For many Victorians, this wasn't rebellion, it was exploration. The same spirit that drove inventors to harness electricity drove mystics to map the unseen. Both believed the universe was governed by laws, and that with patience and precision those laws could be discovered. The Occult Revival didn't overthrow religion or science, it existed between them, offering an esoteric counterpart to the material world's discoveries. It asked a question that remains relevant even now. If we're discovering unseen forces all around us, what other forces might still be waiting to be found? By the late 19th century, spiritualism had spread across continents. Séances were held in mansions, churches, and lecture halls. Newspapers carried reports of new manifestations almost weekly. But what made this movement unlike earlier waves of mysticism was its relationship with science. The Victorians weren't simply believing in this, they were testing it. For the first time, the supernatural wasn't the exclusive territory of clergy or mystics. It was being examined by men and women who had already mapped the heavens, harnessed electricity, and cataloged the laws of motion. The question wasn't, do spirits exist, but can they be measured? In the 1870s, a new term entered the public lexicon, psychical research. It described the scientific study of psychic and spiritual phenomena, from telepathy to apparitions to mediumship. The movement's first major institution was the Society for Psychical Research, founded in London in 1882. Its members included physicists, philosophers, and scholars, among them Sir William Crookes, Alfred Russel Wallace, and Frederick Myers. Their aim was not to promote belief, but to apply scientific discipline to an extraordinary claim. They documented cases, conducted controlled experiments, and tried to separate genuine phenomena from fraud. Crookes, who was already famous for discovering thallium and pioneering work in vacuum tubes, took a particular interest in mediumship. Between 1870 and 1874, he conducted experiments with mediums such as Daniel Douglas Home and Florence Cook. He measured weight changes during séances using precision instruments. He recorded movements of objects while all participants were in view. And in his private notes, he wrote that he had witnessed forms materializing that appeared to have intelligence and mass. Crookes concluded cautiously that some unknown force, possibly related to the human nervous system, was at work. He called it the psychic force. A generation later, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, became one of spiritualism's most prominent defenders. It's easy to forget that Doyle was a trained physician before he became a novelist. His commitment to empirical reasoning was genuine, which made his belief in spiritualism all the more controversial. Doyle lost several family members during World War I, including his son Kingsley. In his grief, he turned to mediums and claimed to have received communication from his son. Convinced of their authenticity, Doyle began touring internationally to promote spiritualism, arguing that it represented the next evolution of science, the science of life after death. In one lecture, he said, "We have had wireless communication between ships and across continents. Why should it be impossible between the material and the spiritual?" For Doyle, the seance room and the laboratory were not opposites, they were stages for the same search of truth. The 19th century was defined by the invisible forces becoming visible. The telegraph carried voices across continents, X-rays revealed bones beneath skin, and electricity lit entire cities. It's no wonder that inventors and engineers began to wonder if similar forces might allow communication with the dead. Thomas Edison reportedly expressed an interest in a spirit communication device in an interview with Scientific American in the early 1920s. If our personality survives, then it is strictly logical to assume that it retains memory, intellect, and other facilities. If so, it's capable of communication. Edison never produced a working prototype, but his statements reflect a widespread belief that technology might one day prove the existence of the soul. Earlier, spirit photographers like William Mumler claimed to capture the departed in faint, translucent images. While most were later revealed to be double exposures, they convinced thousands that photography, the newest technology of the time, could glimpse the afterlife. Even the phonograph was briefly repurposed in experiments to capture disembodied voices, long before the term EVP, or electronic voice phenomenon, entered popular use. Of course, for every believer, there were skeptics, often just as methodical and sometimes equally fascinated by the phenomenon. Illusionists such as Harry Houdini dedicated their careers to exposing fraudulent mediums. Houdini attended séances in disguise, replicating their effects through sleight of hand, ventriloquism, and staged trickery. He respected the emotional need driving spiritualism, but believed its practitioners exploited grief. In 1922, Houdini famously joined a séance hosted by Marjorie Crandon, one of the most famous mediums in the United States. Before an audience of scientists and journalists, spirit hands appeared to materialize from a cabinet, only for Houdini to later reveal a hidden apparatus and manipulation. Still, even as frauds were exposed, the larger question remained unsettled. Could all cases be explained away? Or some of these manifestations genuine? The SPR's archive were filled with testimonies and data that resisted easy classification. The debate never truly ended, it simply evolved. By the early 20th century, spiritualism and science had reached a kind of uneasy truce. The laboratory could not verify the spirit world, but neither could it erase it. In hindsight, what's striking about that period is how earnest it was. The people involved weren't charlatans, typically, or caricatures. Many were very serious thinkers confronting the limits of what they could measure. The séance room and the laboratory both sought evidence of something beyond sight. One looked for electromagnetic waves, the other for persistence of consciousness. And in both cases, the discoveries, whether spiritual or scientific, changed how humanity understood the unseen. By the early 20th century, the movement that had once drawn scientists, writers, and aristocrats into candlelit parlors had begun to fracture under its own weight. Public enthusiasm for seances and spirit photography had collided with exposure after exposure of fraud. The rise of investigative journalism, the spread of stage magic, and the increasing demand for empirical proof all forced spiritualism into retreat. Some of the earliest doubts came from within the movement itself. In 1888, Margaret Fox, one of the original Fox sisters who started the movement 40 years earlier, publicly confessed that the famous rappings had been produced by cracking the joints of her toes against the wooden floor. Her admission made international headlines, yet within a few years she recanted the confession, claiming she'd been pressured by religious groups. Whether she told the truth or simply sought financial stability at the end of her life remains uncertain. Regardless, the damage was done. The spiritualist movement's reputation had been shaken. Fraudulent mediums were routinely caught using hidden wires, telescoping rods, and luminous paint to create spirit lights. The invention of electrical lighting made it harder to conceal tricks in darkened parlors. What had once been seen as mysterious evidence of life after death began to look a lot more like theater. Yet even as public skepticism grew, the deeper hunger that fueled spiritualism never went away, especially in times of mass loss. After the devastation of the First World War, millions of grieving families turned again to mediums and seances for comfort. Across Britain and America, the questions of the afterlife was not a curiosity, it became personal. Prominent figures such as Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, already an outspoken supporter of spiritualism, saw this as the movement's second chance, a healing force in a world shattered by war. While scientific credibility waned, the emotional and philosophical pull remained strong. In the decades that followed, the movement evolved. Spiritualism became less about spirits knocking on walls and more about the broader study of the psychic phenomenon, telepathy, clairvoyance, and psychokinesis. By the 1930s, this effort had taken a new name, parapsychology. At Duke University, researcher J.B. Rhine began conducting statistical experiments on extrasensory perception using cards marked with a simple symbol, circles, waves, crosses, and stars. Rhine wasn't searching for ghosts. He was testing whether the mind could access information beyond the five senses. His methods were quantitative, his approach modern, but the underlying curiosity was the same as the one that had driven the Fox sisters, the Crookes, and Doyle, that consciousness might not be confined to the physical body. Even as organized spiritualism declined, its ideas seeped into Western culture. The New Age movement of the 20th century revived many of its core beliefs: spirit communication, reincarnation, astral travel, and healing through unseen energy. The language of the séance found its way into psychology, self-help, and metaphysics. Mediums never disappeared. They were simply adapting to new formats: radio shows, televised readings, and now online sessions that echo the same rituals once performed by candlelight. And in academia, the Society for Psychical Research continues to exist today, maintaining archives of more than a century of investigations. In hindsight, the spiritualist era was not just a cultural fad, it was a turning point in how modern society grappled with the unknown. It forced science, religion, and philosophy to share the same table. It gave two women unprecedented public roles as mediums and lecturers. It blurred the lines between belief and experiment, and in doing so, it left behind a legacy that still shapes how we talk about the paranormal today. You can see its fingerprints everywhere: in paranormal investigation, in ghost hunting technology, in the language of energy and vibration that threads through modern spirituality. It's easy to look back and dismiss the 19th century séance as superstition, but that would overlook something essential. It was also an early form of human curiosity, a willingness to look directly into the dark and ask if something was looking back. So when you strip away the candlelight and the velvet drapes, what remains is a deeply human question. Every age has its own way of asking it. The Victorians used tables and trumpets. We use cameras, recorders, and quantum theory, but the question hasn't changed. Does something of us survive? And if it does, can it reach across the divide? That question, unanswered but unforgotten, is the reason the story of the 19th century spiritualism still resonates. Because long after the last séance table ever stopped shaking, the search for proof that life continues in some form somewhere never really ended. And that brings us to the end of tonight's deep dive into the rise, fall, and long shadow of the spiritualist era. It was a time when the boundaries between science and belief were unusually thin, when respectable families rearranged their furniture for séances, and when some of the brightest minds in the world genuinely wondered whether the soul could be studied like electricity or magnetism. Whether you walk away from this episode seeing spiritualism as a sincere exploration, a cultural movement, or a cautionary tale, it's impossible to ignore the impact it left behind. The tools may have changed, but the question remains. Questions that still shape paranormal research, modern occult practices, and even the way we talk about consciousness itself. If you've enjoyed this journey into the history of the unseen, make sure to subscribe to the show and share the episode with someone who would appreciate it. And if you've had an experience yourself, something strange, something unexplainable, something that made you rethink the world around you, I'd love to hear about it. You can send me your stories through the Arcane Station website, or send me an email, mike@arcane-station.com. Until next time, thanks for listening, and keep your curiosity open.